Great. Well, thank you. Welcome to everyone who's joining us for the American Heart Association's Center for Health Technology and Innovation, that's CHTI, for this virtual webinar, which is part of the CHTI series of webinars. Our topic today is Making Sense of Sensors, a clinician's guide to patient-generated data. We are coming at this webinar because there now is this world of increasing sensor data that we need to make sense of. And so this webinar is designed to help clinicians navigate the rapidly expanding world of patient-generated health data. We're talking about wearables and biosensors, which can enable remote monitoring platforms and other approaches. And they're producing streams of real-time data, but making sense of all this in the clinical setting can be quite a challenge. So we're very lucky to have an expert panel of clinicians, researchers, digital health experts. They're going to help us break down the latest sensor capabilities, explore practical use cases, and discuss strategies for integrating patient-generated data into clinical workflows. We're going to cover some key considerations here about data quality, what can we trust, and clinical relevance and patient engagement. So thanks again for joining us. I'm Seth Martin. I am a cardiologist professor at Johns Hopkins, where I lead our digital health lab, as well as our lipid clinic. This area of wearables and digital health has really become a big part of my personal work over the last decade, and I think an area that's leading us into a future of medicine that's going to be really personalized and effective. So I've been fortunate to be an advisor to CHTI, as well as to be part of the AHA's Health Tech and Innovation Strategically Focused Research Network. So I think that's enough about me. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves, starting with you, Ben Green. Ben, would you mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Seth. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. My name is Ben Green. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at AliveCor. AliveCor manufactures the KardiaMobile personal ECG devices. Recently launched the Kardia 12 lead, Kardia 12L 12 lead ECG device. I'm a family physician by background, and I spent about 10 years doing home visits and telemedicine in my previous life. So nice to see you all.
Great to have you here, Ben. Dr. Keith Ferdinand. Keith, would you mind introducing yourself next?
Sure, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm Keith Ferdinand. I'm a clinical cardiologist, professor of medicine, and the Gerald S. Berenson Endowed Chair in Preventative Cardiology at the Tulane University School of Medicine in New Orleans, Louisiana. A lot of my work has been in the field of hypertension. I was vice chair of the recent AHA-ACC Multi-Society High Blood Pressure Guideline, and a lot of my perspectives will come from that work, along with my work in hypertension and disparities.
Fantastic. Great to have you here, Keith. And then Catherine Lowe is our third expert, bringing a nice set of complementary expertise and entrepreneur. Catherine, would you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Seth. I'm Catherine Liao. I came to the cardiovascular health as an entrepreneur, working on a cuffless blood pressure monitoring technology using radar. So I founded a company that in that space, and that was later acquired. That experience gave me a very practical view of the challenges around signal quality, validation, and clinical translation of wearables. Today, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Connect Health, and in parallel, I'm working on PhD at the University of Cambridge, focusing on health economics in translating cardiovascular health burdens into concrete economic numbers. I'm also a presidential leadership scholar in 2026, where I work on advancing earlier and more equitable approaches to cardiovascular risk prevention.
Fantastic. We're so lucky to have you here, Catherine. As everyone can tell, we have an amazing panel with complementary, diverse expertise. To kick things off, we wanted to start with some discussion just to kind of level set around the landscape of technologies that are available today. Catherine, you've been part of the creation of new technologies. You're very well versed in this landscape. So I was hoping that you could perhaps kick us off with just a discussion of the types of sensors, technologies that are available. We're going to have a bit of a focus today on blood pressure and heart rhythm. If you could kind of walk us through those technologies, and then we'll, before, just have that as level setting before we move more into the kind of concrete clinical discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Seth. So obviously, as an entrepreneur, we had a thesis around cuffless blood pressure. And at the time when we started the company, well over 10 years ago, there wasn't even really a cuffless technology at all. It was very, very early days. So even just health tracking with using a pedometer, right? So early days of Nike Fuel Band and tracking steps. And so the evolution of that had been what we saw was obviously PPG held a lot of promise, being able to use optical data to capture a pulsatile waveform to translate to blood pressure. But then, of course, it comes with challenges around skin color, pigmentations, and also really the how fiducial that signal is. We ultimately had a thesis around using radar to as a contactless sensing methodology to detect arterial pulsation at the surface of the skin. And of course, they are older technologies that are not truly cuffless. So thinking about tonometry, where that you actually place a small pressure sensor on directly on top of the radial artery to extract blood pressure. Now, the hardest thing about doing all of this is that, we think that blood pressure looks really simple. I just need to get two numbers, peak and trough of a waveform. But translating a pressureless signal into a pressure value is extraordinarily challenging. Whether using machine learning, using a generalized transfer function, we've looked at a lot of that. But fundamentally, because blood pressure itself and how blood pressure fluctuates, changes, is caused by multiple systems in the body. And so, which means that whatever transfer function or whatever ML that's used has to be able to know what is the underlying cause for that blood pressure change. Without really identifying that, really pretty much, everyone ends up being 120/80 and the regression to the mean actually happens. And so there are doesn't mean that it won't be solved. It's definitely very much solvable. We've seen different approach being attempted, and then really kind of perhaps it's just micro pressure to get some pressure units rather than just truly something that is contactless and pressureless. So I'm definitely very optimistic about it can be. But today, right, it's still in investigation, and there are some great promises. And I think what we can do is learn a lot from what ECG has done, right? So if we take a look at what AliveCore has pioneered and really thinking about how do you take a wearable to be clinical grade? And so really using a wearable as a screening and alerting tool, right? That's kind of some of the cleverness on how we are seeing ECGs manifesting themselves onto wearables. Hey, I see that you might have an abnormal rhythm. You should get that followed up. And so we are seeing BP devices or wearables that want to do BP to start taking that path. And it's really about seeing some changes to prompt a follow-up rather than trying to pretend to diagnose that you have a condition. And so that entire experience and thought is how it ultimately shifted my focus on simply chasing a wearable data towards really understanding holistically and how can we use a combination set of tools with a wearable and non-wearables to really paint a holistic picture of that overall health and interpret that in a way that is beneficial to both the patients and the clinicians that treat them.
Thanks, Catherine. I love the way you frame that. I think there's a lot of key threads to pull on from what you discussed. And certainly part of what we need to sort out here together is, what data is ready for prime time? What can we trust from what should trigger then a connection to traditional medical devices and measurements for diagnoses and monitoring? And then ultimately, how does that actually lead to the actions that help people improve their health, reduce heart attacks and strokes, and improve survival, all the things that are going to help people? How do we take all these data and move that direction? And so as we get into that discussion, Ben, I wonder if you want to add anything to kind of just your views of the landscapes of the heart rhythm ECG types technologies, but then we're going to shift to talking about how you're actually using it today in clinic, what is ready for prime time, and and start there, so that we can help clinicians like know what if they're not already doing it, what can they start doing today on the front lines?
Sure. Yeah, with respect to heart rhythm, in 2026, we're in an amazing time. As Catherine and as you mentioned, the landscape has changed and it's changing daily. I did a search on Amazon looking for ECG monitors, and there's over 200 types of monitors and devices out there that a consumer can acquire and start checking their rhythm. I recall actually when I was doing home visits in the late 2000s, we didn't have ECGs. There was no such thing as a personal ECG. PPG for rhythm detection was not was also not available. And I remember managing a patient with a pulse oximeter. She had atrial fibrillation, and she was going into the emergency room often because she had symptoms. She didn't know what was going on. She would go in, and her cardiologist would then connect with her. And I remember the cardiologist called me and said, this patient goes in all the time. Can we help her? And I left my pulse oximeter with her. All it gave her was heart rate, and all it gave me was heart rate. But it at least enabled us to manage that patient, keep her at home. I consulted with a cardiologist frequently, but we were able to keep her at home with a quote unquote rhythm monitor. It was just a pulse oximeter. Fast forward to today, where we have personal ECG, we have PPG, and there's fantastic tools out there, and I think with respect to rhythm, PPG certainly is prevalent in watches and rings and in other devices, and for low risk individuals, for individuals where the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation has already been made. It can be a very, very valuable tool to monitor heart rhythm. Guidelines still point to ECG as the diagnostic test for rhythm abnormalities. So with the CardioMobile device and whether it's a 1-lead ECG, a 6-lead ECG, physicians have really trusted those devices because they now are so available as both a diagnostic tool as well as a tool for managing patients. And certainly we'll dive into some of the clinical use cases that we're seeing. But I think for patients, it's a great time for patients with heart rhythm disorders because they are able to now be safely managed at home. Clinicians are able to confidently manage their patients, and we're seeing just really fantastic results that optimize the patient experience, improve the provider experience of care, and ultimately, improve outcomes and generate cost savings as well. So it's a really interesting time, and I know we'll talk about the future and what's coming. But as of today, it's exciting.
Thanks, Ben. Well, I think it'd be great to dig into some of your clinical use cases even a bit more, kind of, from the standpoint of like making an initial diagnosis in someone that hasn't even had a heart rhythm disorder diagnosed to the time that someone's already, diagnosed and managing it. Clearly, AFib has been at the forefront of, understanding the clinical utility of these technologies. But let's hold that for a moment. I want to bring in Keith, who has been just a tremendous leader in preventive cardiology and in the hypertension space specifically. I think, Rachel, thank you for sharing some links from the American Heart Association for scientific statements, guidelines that Keith has been a leader on. Keith, I want to, many of our patients, obviously hypertension is incredibly prevalent, as is AFib. Many patients have both conditions. You certainly are free to comment on the heart rhythm side of things to the extent that you want, but I'm specifically wanting to hear your perspectives on, in the hypertension space, what is the current role of sensors, of technology? We'll talk about the future-facing part in a little bit, but just as of today, like, how do you see the role here in clinic?
Sure. I'd be very pleased to discuss blood pressure. As you know, of all the modifiable risk factors, systolic blood pressure globally is the most prevalent and potent of all the risk factors. And in fact, if you look across the United States in adults, 48 0.5% to 50% have high blood pressure, defined as 130/80 or above. And you look at certain populations, for instance, the African American populations, patients who live in socially disadvantaged populations, they tend to even have higher degrees of blood pressure. So I am very, very convinced that we need to have ways of better determining who has high blood pressure and how to treat high blood pressure if we want to reduce cardiovascular disease and we want to improve overall survival. In our guideline, the 2025 AHA-ACC Multi-Society High Blood Pressure Guideline, we unfortunately give the cuffless devices a 3. Class 3 means do not do harm. Now, why is that? I think they're clearly wonderful tools. I've already been excited to hear of all the developments in the cuffless blood pressure designs, but in terms of being validated for clinical use, having clinical outcomes with the standard cuff, for instance, in the SPRINT trial, we standardize how the blood pressure should be taken. Using that approach, we don't have the same degree of data as it relates to cuffless devices. So we have this world of material that's coming back us as clinicians, with patients bringing in numbers and pictures of what they see in their watch or smart device. And we really don't know that will reflect appropriate decreases in cardiovascular events. So we give it a class 3. Jordy Cohen from UPenn has done a lot of work with validating blood pressure devices. There's a site, validatebp.org, which is a nonprofit. You can go and look it up and offer to your patients where they can get a validated conventional cuff device. I think that's the way to go. Now, the same is not necessarily true of cuffless devices. They're approved by the FDA, but approval just means they're safe and they have certain data that reflects previous testing. It doesn't say that if you then bring that data to a clinician, that he or she can use it to decrease cardiovascular events and improve morbidity and mortality. That's what we need to have. That biomarker not only is safe and somewhat reproducible, but that if we use that biomarker for therapy, it improves outcomes. I would just like to say in the chat, we've posted both the guideline, the 2025 AHA-ACC guideline, and we have the cuffless blood pressure devices scientific statement, a little bit more focused, but it really deals with some of the techniques. We've already heard that there's some limitations in skin color with breathless mammography in terms of whether or not you're using the wrist or the finger, the algorithms, the learning, machine learning, whether or not it's accurate, whether it's accurate when the patient is moving, obesity, whether or not it's accurate when the patient is in cold, where you have vasoconstriction. There are a lot of things that goes into the determination of blood pressure. So we certainly cannot say with great assuredness that the cuffless devices at this point, as of today, have the same degree of evidence and confidence that we have with traditional blood pressure. One more thing, Seth, before we leave. I've
Please.
also dealt with heart rhythms. I'm a clinical cardiologist, and I do believe that monitoring heart rhythms is heads and shoulders above cuffless blood pressure design. And in fact, there have been some large studies, like the Heartline study and other studies, that have shown you can detect atrial fibrillation in high-risk patients and lead them to therapy, getting evidence-based therapy based on these devices. So I'm not going to say all devices are the same. I think the rhythm detectors are head and shoulders above the blood pressure devices.
Right, right. I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of work in the blood pressure field to try to, it's understandable to want to get that form factor down to something that's super convenient, could live on someone's wrist or as a patch. And there's been a lot of work in this field. And but I think that the scientific statement and your guidelines are giving a very clear message to clinicians that today cuffless BP is not ready for prime time. There's even the potential for harm. So we need to be careful about that. Catherine, I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart, and you've pivoted kind of over time. But before we kind of close the loop on the cuffless blood pressure kind of discussion, did you want to make any additional comments there?
Oh, I think both Ben and Keith have hit on some really good points, and I also agree with Keith that ECG devices are years ahead of where cuffless BP is. But I am optimistic, and also I know we'll talk about this a little bit, but really there are a lot more signals to be had and to be seen within the PPG signal. And so what are some of the insights that we can actually uncover that is related to rhythm as well as pressure that can actually give us additional insights that is credible to then lead to follow-on care and better care.
Mhm. So I think one thing maybe we could like really dig into is if we go upstream as preventive cardiologists, Keith and I really like to go upstream, get as head of the curve as much as possible. So there's a lot of people who have a diagnosis but have not been found yet, and this applies both for hypertension as well as for AFib. So I wonder if we could like really dig in and make sure we're super clear about what our current thoughts are on what is the role of ECG or PPG heart rhythm assessments to find people that haven't been diagnosed yet. Maybe we can start with you, Ben, but then come to the blood pressure world because I think it's starting to emerge this idea of using a wearable not to make a diagnosis of hypertension, not to give an exact blood pressure, but to find someone who appears to have higher risk of having hypertension, then could get connected to traditional medical care using a cuff like ones that Keith mentioned that would show up on validatebp.org. So I wonder, Ben, if we could start with you on the heart rhythm, stance, because that area has been at like the forefront of this idea of finding people that are undiagnosed using consumer wearable devices, and then talk about like where we think we are today and where that's going for hypertension as well.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, when we talk about undiagnosed arrhythmias and atrial fibrillation, if we focus on that, as the the number one arrhythmia worldwide, and it's growing. The prevalence is growing. In the U.S., there's an estimated 10 million individuals with atrial fibrillation. That's probably an underestimate. But how many of those are currently diagnosed? There's certainly many that are undiagnosed. With regards to systematic screening interventions, the USPSTF still rates AFib screening as an I, so that the data right now is insufficient to recommend broad systemic screening, as you mentioned, Keith, with the cuffless blood pressure cuffs. The data just isn't quite there yet that the benefits outweigh the harms. Nonetheless, we have consumers checking themselves. They're checking already. So what do we do with that information? And I think it does come back to the quality of the data. So if individuals are using validated devices, ECG, preferably, because it can be diagnostic. So when a physician is presented with ECG data from a consumer that is showing atrial fibrillation, then they could be confident that in fact it is atrial fibrillation. Now they may certainly do follow-up testing and a follow-up 12-lead ECG, but the validity of that data and the quality of that data is really making diagnosis much more accessible for consumers. There are certainly many consumers that are using PPG devices for self-screening, and as long as a confirmatory ECG is done, then that also can certainly translate into detecting these undiagnosed individuals. But I certainly see there's some very big trials underway for broader AFib screening and looking at outcomes, looking at stroke reduction. And I'm very confident that we're going to see a change in the recommendations with regards to atrial fibrillation screening. But today, opportunistic screening, whether a person's coming into the clinic doing a point of care quick ECG is something that we see often. And it's something that I think, again, the quality of the data is changed from where it was 10 years ago. We can get diagnostic level data in patients' hands, and it's really changing the game with respect to diagnosis.
Great, thanks, Ben. Keith, I think we're starting on the hypertension blood pressure side to see this idea of like giving someone an alert that they might have hypertension. If someone like that shows up in your clinic, how would you kind of perceive that? Would you be happy that they showed up? How much would you kind of stock would you put in that alert? What would be your kind of your next step? I think I can guess, but I'd love to hear what you're thinking.
Well, first, I'm going to clarify. You said something in a very casual manner that many in the audience may have missed. It's an alert. It's not a measurement of blood pressure. And in
Yeah.
fact, one of the more recently approved devices by the FDA is for persons who don't have hypertension. It just tells the person that there is a possibility that they do have hypertension. So if you have hypertension, over 50% of the adult population, when you get 65, it's 65%, higher in Black populations, you don't need a wristwatch or some new device to tell you have hypertension. You got it. And the device will not tell you if you have hypertension, whether or not it's controlled. That's the reason why we treat blood pressure, to decrease cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. Now, I'll answer your question. If the person brings in this alert and they are unaware that they previously were diagnosed with hypertension, I would use a valid cuff using appropriate techniques, sitting, feet on the floor, back supported, arm at heart level, no eating, drinking, smoking. Check it 3 times, averaging at least 2, and then repeating it again in an out-of-office setting. We know that about 15% of people do have what they call white coat hypertension or white coat effect, where the blood pressure is elevated in the clinical setting. We used to think the patients were just kind of saying it, but now with valid devices, outpatient setting, we're seeing that indeed is true. I would use that as a true signal to better diagnose whether that person has hypertension. So I'm not going to suggest that the cuffless devices are null and void as a tool in clinical medicine, but it won't take the place of a validated traditional cuff.
It could be a good starting point.
Oh, sure.
Similar to other things like in prevention, like when we do a 10-year risk calculation, we're not necessarily saying that's a perfectly accurate measure, but it can be a great starting point for discussion and decision making. It's not a perfect analogy, but it can serve as a starting point for discussion around next steps. And similar here, it's not that if this brings someone to care about their health and then ultimately use a medical grade device and make a diagnosis and get treated, that could be a very good thing. And I'll just give a plug for your hypertension guidelines, like the figures and the guidance around home blood pressure monitoring is really excellent. So I would, if folks haven't seen that and this is an area of interest, I would point you to that information in the HA guidelines on home blood pressure monitoring.
And just as a plug, Seth, it's class 1A, out of office blood pressure monitoring, whether it be an ABPM or home blood pressure monitor. It's not something that you consider, you should do.
Great. Okay. We are getting some questions in the Q&A area. And although I was initially thinking we may save those towards the end, I am starting to see a theme here. And I think, like Catherine, you would be perfect to kick us off with this type of discussion. And this does get into an area where we wanted to kind of make sure we really locked in around data quality, validation, ultimately, what can we trust? And so I see a question around, like, what are the best pathways to validate devices? What are essential markers that one should look for when evaluating the accuracy and reliability of a wearable device? So I'm seeing a bit of a theme here, Catherine. I wonder if you could, I know you have a lot of experience in this area evaluating devices, if you could kick off the discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Stas. And they're very thematic. Everybody wants to know, give me the one magic answer so then I can validate my device and sell it to everybody and make billions of dollars, right? I will probably change the questioning a little bit to say, what problem are you solving? And because depending on what problem you are solving, the validation and the clinical utility varies. But in the simplest term, from a cuffless blood pressure BP perspective, if we look at the current BP guideline, right, it's the BP validation guideline has specified a certain size of population, a certain blood pressure ranges and distribution of the blood pressure ranges. All those are collected at rest and then seated properly, as Keith had mentioned. So first of all, at a minimum, you need to do that. But now the challenge with cuffless is that these data are being measured in ambulatory settings on the go. We know that as I'm talking, my blood pressure is going to be higher. I stand up, I walk, my blood pressure is going to be bouncing all over the place. What is actually the right blood pressure? All those blood pressure could be right, but what is actually clinically relevant? And so what we did and we thought about is you start thinking about sensor fusion. How do I put context on these measurements, on when these measurements are taken? For example, this BP reading, we can see that with an accelerometer, this person has been still for the last 5 minutes with stable heart rate. Okay, so there's some reliability potentially in that reading. So, but that's very difficult to do. And also you would need a large amount of population environments to really add credibility to the output of that data. And so this is why I say, well, let's start with what problem are we solving? So using Apple as an example, what we want to solve is we know that 1 in 2 adults in America has hypertension. So, and most of them don't know. Can we start with a thesis of if we simply nudge somebody to let them know that they might be hypertensive, that is a job, then like there's value in just doing that. And in fact, I just had that experience 2 weeks ago at a conference with a colleague who's actually who's a clinician who has an Apple Watch and said, "Oh, the Apple Watch told me that I might be hypertensive, but I don't believe it." And I carry a blood pressure monitor with me, as I do. Which is the device is on validatedbp.org. And I took it out. I sat her down, had her take a measurement, and she absolutely was hypertensive. And then the follow-on question is, I basically said, here, take my device, take it home. We are in a busy setting. You've been busy. This is not the right time to assess this. So take it home. When you've relaxed a little bit, then take your measurements and then that's have another conversation and then take it to your clinician if that number remains to be elevated. And so that's probably the type of workflow that clinicians would like to see and triggered by a wearable. And so for that, I mean, that is that wearable doing its job. So I close it with what job do you want your wearable to do? And then you can think about validation steps from there on.
I do love the way you frame that around, what is the problem you're solving? Because that is absolutely critical that we come in with that mindset of not just having technologies, even if they're validated, but understanding how they're actually going to move the needle, how they're going to solve problems that we have in the current clinical environment. I would like to open it up for Keith or Ben to comment on this question of best pathways for validation if you'd like. I did also see a somewhat related question come in around the calibration component, and this is specifically related to wearable BP devices. It appears like when they've been tested, one critical ingredient was the weekly calibration. Again, we're saying the evidence at this time is saying these devices are not ready for prime time. The guidelines don't recommend them. But as they continue to be developed, that calibration piece is an important consideration. Keith, did you have any comments in that area?
Yeah, so you can't just buy it, get it out the box, and use it forever. You do have to calibrate it at baseline. Some suggestion is it should be done weekly, monthly, or at least semi-annually thereafter to make sure that it maintains. Also, there's a question whether or not activity can actually affect the outcomes on cuffless blood pressures. Now, I don't want to be a naysayer. Certainly, as the technology evolves, artificial intelligence, machine learning helps us to understand what happens with movement in certain positions. We may get more data, and it may also help in those persons who live in socially disadvantaged populations where they don't have that really readily available clinical visit, that now they have a device which may be easy, more mobile, and can detect hypertension, and then they can seek care. But for many people, it's not easy just to, quote, find a doctor or nurse practitioner if they live in remote rural areas, or even in some inner city urban areas. There are some fairly qualified health centers, but it may be difficult to get an appointment. So if this device is going to alert a person that they may indeed have hypertension and then drives them to take the time and effort to get an appropriate evaluation, that's a good thing. I'm certainly not opposed to that.
Great. Thanks, Keith. Ben, before we move on, any comments on the validation piece?
Yeah. Yeah, validation, as I mentioned earlier, it's critically important, and for the device that's being used, whether it's an ECG device, a PPG, a blood pressure cuff, the host of other sensors that are available. And I think it goes back to the research. So we have to see high quality studies showing that the device, whether it's a new device, existing device, is comparable to the existing gold standard. So at AliveCor, we have over 250 studies. Many of those are validation studies showing diagnostic equivalence to the gold standard. And but the challenge, I think, is clinicians aren't going to read those studies. They don't have time to read all the studies, and there's so many new sensors coming out, and every manufacturer is going to claim that their device is valid. There is some level of quality, and in many cases that's true. But I think we need to see high quality studies that are appropriately powered, that do show accuracy and validity to the existing gold standard. Otherwise, it's really challenging for clinicians, for patients to make sense of data coming in. Can I trust this data? So I think it is incumbent on manufacturers to do the appropriate studies, to communicate that data, and like what Validate BP has done, where they are an independent arbiter of devices, and they are at least recommending to clinicians and to patients that these are devices that have been validated, that have been trusted. We don't have that with the host of other sensors yet today. Even with ECG, I think there is ECG and PPG for rhythm disorders. There's a lot of noise out there. So I think it is, like I said, incumbent on manufacturers to do the appropriate studies to show diagnostic equivalence. And that takes time, it takes money, and there aren't shortcuts, I'll say, in making sure that we're managing patients, providers are managing patients. We have to trust the data, and we have to do it appropriately.
I like that point about that Validate BP is that type of model is not necessarily available in other areas of cardiology, but one wonders if it couldn't be in the future. Like as a clinician, it is very useful to have that as a trusted place to say, like, I'm not recommending one specific brand but here's a place where you can choose one that is validated, and so maybe that will expand in the future for other sensors, and that'll help clinicians, like it'd be an easy way to direct patients in terms of to validated data points. I wonder.
One last thing, just quickly to that point. I would point providers to aggregate guidelines. So ACC, AHA guidelines on atrial fibrillation. Those are fantastic. The ESC guidelines. So there are certainly organized guidelines that call out the devices and consumer devices and make recommendations. So if you're looking for, rather than looking through all the individual studies, go to the guidelines, and those are the trusted sources today. And that's certainly what we recommend.
Okay, so I wonder, I have a few other topics want to kind of dig into, and then we'll definitely, there's more and more questions coming in, so I want to get to as many of those as we can as well. I wondered if we could just, we talked about making initial diagnosis. I wonder, Ben, if you want to just like be very clear around where you see the current role of wearables, wrist-worn technologies, patches in someone who's already has a diagnosis of AFib, and you're assessing their ongoing burden and how that's guiding your clinical management.
Certainly, yeah. With established individuals with established diagnosis of atrial fibrillation, we are seeing certainly wearables, PPG-based devices and ECG-based devices as being appropriate devices for monitoring recurrence. AFib burden is something that we're seeing proxy measures of AFib burden with wearable devices, and ECG. So even if it's not a continuous assessment of burden, again, there's ways to measure burden. There was a study done looking at intermittent use of ECG to approximate burden. So I think there are ways now for wearable devices to translate, whether it's intermittent or partially continuous monitoring into metrics that we've seen only previously with implantables and devices like those. So it is, we are seeing changes in how devices are being used. With respect to ECG, one other interesting use case we've been seeing is use of ECG for QT prolongation monitoring. There's a group in Ohio at Ohio Health where they've now transitioned individuals who are being loaded with antiarrhythmic sotalol from a hospital load to a home load. So this was previously a 3-day hospital stay. So now they're able to provide a 6-lead ECG, measure QT at home. So they've now saved a 3-day hospital stay with very high patient satisfaction, and most importantly, 100% patient safety. So things like that things are changing in terms of use cases and in individuals with an established diagnosis.
That's another great clinical example beyond AFib. Thanks for sharing, Ben. Why don't we do this? We have a bunch of questions I want to get to. I'd like to just hear from everyone about where you think this is all going. What is the future going to look like? We talked about some areas where things are ready. The sensors, the wearables are ready for prime time. Other areas where they're not yet and not getting guideline endorsement. But where do we think in the next 5 to 10 years things are headed? What do you all want to see in the future? Keith, let's start with you.
I think in the future, the cuffless devices will be validated. The FDA has a site, I put it into a link, or it should be up in the link, where they're asking for comments on how best to validate these devices. And once we do that, I don't think it's going to replace the conventional cuff. But what it may do is what has already been mentioned by Ben, is to simplify our diagnostic procedures where we say, if this person brings in this data, it's real. And then that we use the cuff maybe in terms of pharmacotherapy and titration of medications. But I'm not going to just tell a patient, oh, I don't look at that. That's not valid. It will be validated in the future. It may also help with nocturnal blood pressure. Even the ABPM, the ambulatory blood pressure device, has a certain degree of alert or alarm with it when it pumps the arm 30 minutes during sleep. So you may be getting falsely elevated pressures. If you have a valid cuffless device, you may get a better picture of nocturnal hypertension, which is an independent risk marker for cardiovascular events beyond daytime blood pressure. So it may be something that's going to be really beneficial there.
Great, Keith. We have more questions that I'm going to be bringing back to you, but for now, let's turn to Catherine. Your thoughts on the future, where things are headed.
Oh, I think the future looks bright. So I have seen some very promising technology in ring form factors that are doing BP, and they're currently going through a validation process. And certainly it's promising. We're seeing the right fluctuations that one would expect in ambulatory settings. And totally agree with Keith. I mean, gosh, to have nocturnal BP and see that nocturnal dip, I mean, that is a key data points that's currently missing or difficult to get. Now, from my perspective, I want to go beyond just BP. A lot of my focus is around arterial health, and there are non-pressure related metrics that are indicative of arterial stiffness. And so what if we bring that information into the context, right? So yes, there might be a BP alert, may not be a validated BP, but there's an alert on BP elevation. And then we can take in indices around arterial health to actually say, yeah, you know what, that's most likely true because these ratios that I'm seeing within the waveform tells me something that is indicative and it's validated, it's proven. Now I actually have a better set of data to inform a clinician to now take the next steps. And of course, what then needs to happen is this, so what, right? We also need to have a treatment plan, we need to have a mechanism to address the elevated BP or elevated physiological status. And so that's another area that I and my team are heavily focused on, is without having a treatment plan or solution to be able to address it, having data on its own is not that useful.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Ben.
Yeah, I think one thing that I see happening, we're talking about blood pressure cuffs, we're talking about ECG monitors. I do see, and this is already starting to happen, a synthesizing of disparate data sources into more unified metrics to inform whether that's treatment decisions, so personalized medications. Because we have various data points that are coming together. I know we're still kind of in maybe the first inning where we're still trying to just get people on a medicine, just trying to get those people that are with high blood pressure who are not controlled on a medication. But then I think in the future, with this plethora of data, we're able to really get personalized with the data, with the treatments that we're able to prescribe. With respect to ECG, I think there's a lot of exciting things happening. I think we've talked a lot about making a diagnosis, tracking someone with known arrhythmias, but we're seeing a lot with prediction of disease in the ECG space. So there's a lot of interesting AI models that are being developed in the research world. Also, some that have reached commercialization where prediction of atrial fibrillation. So am I going to have an event in the next 30 days or 30 minutes? So we can get more specific with our therapies. So things like intermittent anticoagulation, intermittent rate control, I think is something we're seeing already today with some of the research models. There's an interesting research model within the NHS where they're looking at ECG to predict mortality, to predict heart failure development, to predict other ventricular arrhythmias with very high accuracy. So I think we're going to see a move from just making a diagnosis to predicting disease. And then more importantly, does that change people's behavior? So if I know as a consumer that I'm at very high risk for a very concerning condition, is that going to change my behavior today? I don't know. We'll see. But there's the power to do that. If we're synthesizing multiple data sources, that's giving a consumer pretty high confidence that they're going to develop disease X, that may change behavior, for the positive.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I mean, it is really critical that it does change behavior in a positive way that improves outcomes. But I love that from a preventive cardiology standpoint, we love predicting risk, get ahead of the risk. So if that's where we're going and we can actually prevent the diagnosis in the first place, that gets at what we call primordial prevention. That would be fantastic. The other thing I'll say is my hope for the future is that we're going to connect all these data in a way that we close the loop to use evidence-based interventions where we really reduce risk and improve patient outcomes. I do hope we have personalized medicines and all that in the future. I also hope we just do a much, much better job using standard therapies. Many of these are cheap therapies that have been around for a while, but they're highly underutilizing. I'm thinking about things like blood pressure, antihypertensives, cholesterol lowering therapies, where we have such potential to close the gaps, and so I hope that these data all inspire and activate a whole lot more of that, and that may require building this into programs that kind of provide that full set of cardiovascular care, and where we learn from the technology, but also about just implementation strategies that are able to bring people in and get the job done. Okay, we have a bunch of questions, which is fantastic. Keith, I'm going to start with you. We have a question from one of our CHTI advisors, Asif Ali, who's asked about the HA guidelines. And as you already mentioned, blood pressure should be taken sitting, feet uncrossed, the whole parameters around how blood pressure is optimally measured. So then how do you think about if a wearable blood pressure assessment, if people are in different positions? You brought up actually the nocturnal piece, which is really interesting. So someone might be lying down, they might be sleeping, they might be standing, they might be moving. So how do you think that's gonna all these different, we're gonna get all this additional data beyond the traditional kind of resting standard position for blood pressure measurement? How do you think about that?
So we do say class 1A for out of office, it could be either a home monitored unit or an ambulatory blood pressure device, which will give you nocturnal hypertension. But I mentioned the nighttime alert when that cuff goes up, it may be giving some falsely elevated numbers. So these devices in the future may be able to give us a better picture of the circadian rhythm of blood pressure and a better picture of nocturnal hypertension, even beyond the conventional ABPM. But let me say the following. America's making a big mistake if we move away from evidence-based medicine. If you go back as early as the 1960s, they did placebo-controlled trials in persons who had systolic blood pressures that were in veterans in the 160s. And they were able to put one group of patients on older medicines, not even as good or well tolerated as what we have today, things like methyl-dopa, reserpine, hydrochlorothiazide, versus placebo, nothing. After 2 years, half of the veterans who were in placebo had heart attack, stroke, or were dead. And I don't want to see placebo-controlled trials. So I think a cuffless device would have to be validated with a traditional device, not randomizing the person to treatment or not treatment. We've done that game before, but seeing to what extent the cuffless device mirrors the type of outcomes we've seen with 5 millimeters of systolic blood pressure in high-risk patients, decreasing cardiovascular events. So I'm still going to treat those patients. I'm not going to use the cuffless device just to get a number. I also think patients should not divorce themselves from the traditional clinician, whether it be the clinical pharmacist, the physician, the nurse practitioner, advanced practice nurse, because it's been proving that lowering blood pressure is one of the best things you can do for not only decreasing cardiovascular events, but total mortality. And the dirty secret about medicine, there's not much that we do that decreases total mortality.
Yeah, really critical point. Thank you, Keith. Um, we have another question that came in on the early side around reimbursement, and I wonder if anybody wants to comment around reimbursement. This question is asking if codes for RPM provide an incentive to prescribe RPM and with FDA cleared wearables. So, does anyone have any comments about reimbursement and how that's kind of affected your lives or how you see that more broadly?
Sure, I can comment, and I think in 2026, so there are new RPM codes, as I'm sure many are aware, and I think that is going to change behaviors of providers. I think up until now, the existing RPM codes have been quite underutilized. I think the effort in billing and using those codes was not worth the reimbursement. But I think things are changing, and I think those new codes, which essentially make it less burdensome for patients to provide data and for physicians and providers to receive that data. So I think it's a good thing. I think it's going to open up use of wearables and FDA cleared devices for appropriate use. I think the pendulum, it could swing in a direction where we're going to see overutilization and prescribing just for the sake of prescribing. Yeah, I think that's certainly a risk. But I think devices have been underutilized by providers because of I think the lack of appropriate reimbursement pathways. And so I think this year in particular, I think it's a new day. So we'll see how it all shakes out. But I think ultimately, I think it's a good thing for patients. I think it's a good thing for providers to now align incentives, align use, of these devices.
Seth,
Yep.
antidotes are not clinical trials, but I have seen in my clinical practice people who do make the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation using one of these out-of-office home devices, and will come in and we'll do a conventional measurement with either a long-term monitor or even just a 12-lead ECG, and they're right, they have atrial fibrillation. If we do a risk assessment, Chad Vass, those patients may need medicines, and they wouldn't have known it unless they used the device. The same may be true with the new blood pressure devices as they develop, and that patient brings in that data. I'm not going to blow them off. I'm going to recheck it again, and they might be right. They have hypertension.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks, Keith. Another really interesting question came in, and we're going to try to get as many of these questions in the last few minutes as we can around use of AI, that there's the opportunity to take your wearable data, let the AI read it and ask it questions. And do we see this as potentially valuable, actionable at the moment. I know we have been emphasizing throughout the conversation that there's an important kind of complement synergy between these data out of the traditional medical system, bringing them in. This seems like it would largely be out of the traditional medical system, someone processing the data on their own and possibly getting insights, taking actions, although they may then bring that into the medical office. Catherine, is this something you've tried yourself? Any of your friends or colleagues have tried? Do you have any perspective on this?
Oh, I do it all the time. I take my CGM data, I take, my wearable data, and really it's exploration of, hey, what is going on in my body. Now that's I am a healthy subject, so I am a bad example, right? Because and on top of that, I spend a lot of my time in reading literature. And so for me, AI serves for a tool to distill and getting through data that it would just take too long for me to do it manually. And that's tremendously valuable. And then potentially highlight discrepancies or highlight insights that I wouldn't otherwise catch very easily without spending quite a bit of time into it. And so I certainly see AI as a phenomenal tool to help all of us to do our jobs better and spending and getting to perhaps insights that we haven't had a chance to be able to dive in ourselves. Now, the other end of the coin there is, well, what happens if that gets into someone who is not as well versed? We all know that the AI tool is as good as your prompting is, and also your prompting is informed by how experienced that you are in the subject matter. And so the challenge there it will be that we will very much see a large inbound of questions, probably a correct answer from AI, but that was based on a question that was asked poorly. Now, do I have an answer for that? I do not. I don't. I think this is something that everyone is thinking about actively and looking to solve for it. But I certainly hold and I stand on the side of the having this capability will enable us to do discovery faster and potentially get to insights that wouldn't otherwise be surfaced very easily. Now, then what we need to solve for as technologists is now really understanding what is the right guardrail whereby we are actually able to train these models to inform the subjects based on, to Ben's point, evidence-based insights that are coming generated from not just peer-reviewed papers, because there are plenty of papers that are flawed, but really papers and study designs that are considered top-notch and valid.
Thank you, Catherine. This has just been an amazing discussion. I really want to. I know there's more questions. We can work with the AHA team to figure out how we might be able to address questions offline. But this is just. I just want to thank our expert panelists for all their insights. This was just a wonderful discussion. And I want to invite you to the next webinar from the CHTI. It's Classroom to Care, Building AI-Ready Health Professionals on March 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So the link is in the chat. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Keith. I really appreciate the discussion.
Thank you,
Thanks
Fess.
so much.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Are we?
think I
Someone needs to stop recording.
I'm not sure if they've stopped recording, but I think we can all. I know we're up at the hour, so we can all hop off. Thank you again, everyone.
All
Thank you,
right.
everyone.
See you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Great to meet you guys. Yeah, it was fun.